Oh boy, another pre-built. I kinda feel a rant coming on. Last time I toyed the pre-built, it was a HP machine that underwent renovations. This time it's a Dell, but if the labels were removed and I started poking around, I would not be able to tell one's non-standardness from the other. I picked up this DELL Inspiron 3668 PC locally with the view to dissect it and transplant the important bits to a nice case and chuck in a mid-range GPU like a 960 or RX 580 in there. I thought to myself that it would make a fine gaming machine. After all, as far as I know, there is nothing wrong with this PC. Well, apart from being incredibly dusty and only running off of a hard drive. Oh, that and the fact that it has a single 60GB stick of RAM. No dual channel here. For that, you actually have to pay Dell extra. In any event, this CPU is a very solid i7-7700 that is very respectable in both gaming and productivity, and by default there is no GPU to be had apart from the integrated one. Of which I will promptly forget about its existence because it's a rather hot day and I don't want to get annoyed. Taking the motherboard out and the backplate is, well, glued in place, which really does not bode well, as that cooler looks like it'd be at home in a mid-90s budget PC. Get this, it's actually called Dell 65W cooler, and I can attest to the fact that it can't handle watt more over that. At this point I began to suspect it might be a more involved job than I had thought. The plan was to change the cooler, take an add to PSU board and add a Corsair 500W extra PSU and some long USB 3 extensions for the front of a new case, because obviously there are no USB 3 internal headers because they're all integrated. Spoiler alert, not a single motherboard hole matched the ATX standard. It's like they went out of their way to make sure it is in no way compatible. After taking the PSU apart to inspect it, it looks basic but in very good shape, and with only 12 volts out and 250 watts, that is to be expected. Thinking about the next steps, I began having this sinking feeling that I will need to cop out and just limit myself to a non-power GPU. Don't get me wrong, what I originally planned on doing is totally feasible, but it does involve chopping up the Dell case to get its side with the integrated standoffs and transplanting that together with the motherboard to a new case. But at some point you really have to ask if the next 10 to 15 hours of work to get everything modified and fitting nicely are worth it. Obviously I will not be testing this with the included single stick of RAM. For the moment I am replacing it with a 2x8GB DDR4 3000 MB/s Corsair kit, fully knowing there is no way to enable XMP. I might change this down the line depending on circumstances, but whatever it will be, it will definitely run in dual channel. Mostly because I'm not a monster. Let's see what else. Well, one of the Wi-Fi antennas was broken and I soldered it back together, and I had to do some light modifications to get a 1TB laptop hard drive in there, as the 3.5-inch one that came with it will no longer fit alongside the GPU. With all this in mind, I proceeded to clean a 1050 Ti in preparation for its installation. This is an Asus Cerberus card that is technically overclocked, by quite a bit I might add, but does not take any auxiliary power. Comparing this to an integrated GPU like the Vega 11 is unfair, since, well, that one is integrated and this one is not. But also comparing it to something that costs around the same like an RX 480 or a GTX 970 is again unfair, considering this uses less than half the power of those GPUs, in certain circumstances even trending towards a quarter. My solution was to split the difference and to do the synthetic test with the same settings as the mid-ranges, but for the gaming benchmarks to test a wider array of settings. Considering that I don't plan on doing builds with PCIe slot power limited GPUs that often, it should be a reasonable compromise. After running a couple of benchmarks, it was apparent that the OEM cooler is causing really bad temperature spikes that cause the frequency to fluctuate wildly to compensate alongside the power draw of the CPU. I then noticed that every time the CPU power draw went over 55-ish watts, the GPU dropped 3-4 watts, which had a small but measurable effect on the average frame rate. It makes sense that when you only have 69 watts maximum power budget to play with, 3-4 watts matter a lot more than if you had 350 watts at your disposal like a higher end card. I will show some side-by-side comparison and discuss this further, but forgetting about the performance for a moment, I did not feel comfortable with 98C on the CPU die. No matter what the TJmax is somewhere around the 100C, it's still a bit insane in my opinion. To address this, I swapped the Core i7 7700 to a Core i5 7600, essentially only one step down, same 4-core CPU but non-hyperthreaded, and it made a world of difference. The average frame rate increased, the frame time spikes were dulled, and the temperature was a positively enjoyable 77C max. Remember, that is down from 98C before. Also, this marks the first time I think ever that I can justifiably claim that a downgrade has helped performance. Someone at Dell should really start deep diving their internal guidelines because they are just plain wrong when it comes to real world use. Yes, that cooler might in a CAE simulation be able to dissipate 65 watts of heat, but that is under ideal conditions. And for that matter, so is the testing I am doing. This is in the UK in a temperature control room at 21C. If this was you saying Southern Europe during the summer in a non-air conditioned environment, then this would throttle almost immediately because it has zero over provision in the cooler choice. Anyway, enough of that, let's get into the benchmarks. Heaven is an older benchmark but still very much relevant since it pushes all GPUs to their upper utilization limit. It's just how it's coded to work. Here we get 59.4 FPS on the i5 and 58.8 FPS on the i7. Considering that Heaven is a pure GPU benchmark, this raises some red flags for me. If I needed to guess, I would have definitely given the edge to the i7 here, and normally it would have no issues taking the lead, and I can't quite yet blame the CPU cooler. I think it might have been the lower power consumption of the i5 CPU that allowed the GPU to sit at 69 watts just for a tad bit longer. Regardless, the results are within margin of error though. Superposition is a much newer benchmark made by the same people behind Heaven, and it shows with the average going way down to 32 and 33 FPS respectively. Again, the 7600 edged out the 7700 only by 1 FPS, but still a measurable amount. Here are the two results side by side. And please bear in mind I changed virtually nothing else but the CPU, with all other parameters remaining the same. Rocket League ran very well on this configuration regardless of the choice of processor. I only opted to test 1080p max because frame rates in excess of 100 FPS on a budget configuration I think is a win no matter how you look at it. I find that on most machines that I test Fortnite on, it has some sort of frame time spikes, without exception. I am vaguely aware that there is a debate in some corners of the internet on how to fix this and whether or not it's an unavoidable engine limitation, but for our purpose, running at Epic 1080p returns about 40 FPS on average. Not bad, but not so great for a game like Fortnite, and that is discounting the frame spikes. Going down to medium with epic draw distance for those far off snipes pushes frame rates towards 90 FPS on average, and also if not altogether removing the frame spikes, it does make them a lot less annoying, to the point where you don't really notice them anymore unless you are specifically looking at the graph. If you must have over 100 FPS, I would suggest dropping the resolution scale to about 90 instead of going down in settings to retain a bit of eye candy. Horizon Zero Dawn, the discrepancy between the two processors is even more pronounced, with the i7 getting 45 FPS and the i5 getting 48 FPS. In places it varies a lot more. For example, this screenshot shows a 4 FPS difference in favor of the i5. That is crazy, and if it wasn't repeatable or a fluke, I would not be telling you about it. In any event, it was a good experience, and in game you can expect averages in the mid-50s. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I really did not notice any difference between the two configurations. The maximum frame rate was a bit higher in the i7, but the i5 posted identical average frame rates and a bit more consistent experience. The fact that this GPU can run a latest gen game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla on medium with very playable frame rates I think is a good stamp of approval, if the situation requires it, that is. It outperforms any integrated GPU hands down without breaking a sweat, but if your power budget wasn't a concern, for roughly the same price I would still go with an RX 480 or GTX 970. Everyone's favorite bugfest, Cyberpunk 2077, puts on a decent showing at low and 80% resolution scale. I am driving around a challenging area for any GPU, and while there are some dips here and there, the overall fluidity of the game is good. There are various third-party tools that have been developed by enthusiasts that can optimize the settings even more. I would not be surprised if 35 to 40 FPS can be achieved on this card without any sort of resolution scale with a bit of work. But for the majority of people who might not be inclined to go down the modding route, I would still call this game playable and enjoyable as stock, Borg physics notwithstanding. Days Gone runs at 30 FPS at very high and 60 FPS at low, with very much proportional scaling with all the presets in between. This is a very good looking game that does surprisingly well on all manner of hardware. But you must wonder, given the popularity of the 1050 Ti and having all the modes so neatly tuned to a specific FPS range at 1080p, if the developers did not give it just a smidge more attention than less popular cards. Also, there is the option of using the resolution scale slider, but because this is for testing, I try to keep that at 100% as much as possible because it muddies the waters otherwise. One more interesting tidbit. I tested this game recently on R9 290 and an i5 6600, and the 6600 bottlenecked the R9 very badly. I was expecting to see the CPUs here being pummeled, but it really wasn't that bad, with the 7th gen CPUs managing to handle this game a lot better. I'm willing to bet it's most likely an architecture improvement, with the game being better optimized for the newer hardware. Like Days Gone, Biomutant also stays just above 30 FPS at max and very close to 60 at low, with steps in between at medium and high. Personally, because this is a bit of a fast-paced game, I would stick to medium, as I find it gives you the best balance between eye-candy and fluidity. But then again, this is personal preference. All modes are very much playable. And that's about it for the gaming benchmarks. I found it very odd saying over and over that the i5 beats the i7. Obviously, this is just in a very narrow sense that the i7 simply draws too much power and creates too much heat in this Dell PC. In a more standardized setting, the i7 will lead the i5 by a significant margin every single test and game. This can be exemplified by running Cinebench side by side. Both clips have been sped up the exact same amount, and the i7 4-core and 8-thread processor finishes ahead thanks to the extra threads, landing it between the Ryzen 1600AF and the Ryzen 3400G, a 6-core 12-thread and a 4-core 8-thread SMT processor respectively, with the 7600 being a 4-core 4-thread part landing just above the 3200G, again a 4-core and 4-thread CPU. The main difference is that the 7700 ran all the way up to 98C in this test, and the 7600 only ever hit 77. And well, that is about it for this video. In the end, what resulted was a nice and compact gaming PC. But those lofty goals I set myself at the beginning need to wait for me to get a more suitable motherboard. Although this Dell will be present in spirit, as I'll be reusing its 7700 CPU in a future build. I hope you found it entertaining, and well, see you in the next one.